Please, Hermione, tell me you weren't one of the 46, said Ron, as he left the Grey Hall for the first lesson. Hermione suddenly became very interested in searching her bag for her schedule and didn't answer. All day long, the dwarfs kept barging into their classrooms to deliver valentines to the annoyance of all the teachers. The late afternoon, the dwarfs caught up with Harry. "Oi, you, Harry Potter!" shouted a particular grim-looking dwarf, elbowing people out of the way to get to Harry. Not all over in not all over at the thought of being given a valentine in front of a line of first years, which happened to include Ginny Weasley. Harry tried to escape. The dwarf, however, cut his way through the crowd, kicking people in the shins, and reached him before he'd gone 2 paces. "I've got a musical message to deliver from Harry Potter in person," he said, twanging his harp in a threatening sort of way. "Not here!" Harry hissed, trying to escape. "Stay still!" grunted the dwarf, grabbing hold of Harry's bag and pulling him back. "Let me go!" Harry snarled, tugging. With a loud ripping noise, his bag split in two. His books, wand, parchment, quill spilled onto the floor. His ink bottle smashed over everything. Harry scrambled around, trying to pick it up before the dwarf started to sing, causing something of a hold-up in the corridor. "What's going on here?" came a cold, drawling voice of Draco Malfoy. Harry Potter stuffing everything feverishly into his ripped bag, desperate to get away before Malfoy could hear the musical valentine. "What is all the commotion?" said another familiar voice. Percy Weasley arrived. Losing his head, Harry tried to make a run for it, but the dwarf seized him around the knees and brought him crashing to the floor. "Right!" he said, sitting on Harry's ankles. "Here's your singing valentine. His eyes are green and fresh pickled toad. His hair's dark as a blackboard. I wish he was mine. He really's divine. The hero conquered the Dark Lord." Harry would have given all the golden Gringotts to evaporate on the spot, trying valiantly to laugh along with everyone else as he got up. His feet were numb from the weight of the dwarf, as Percy Weasley did the best to disperse the crowd, some of whom were crying with mirth. "Off you go, off you go! Bell rang 5 minutes ago. Off you go. Off to class now," he said, shooing some of the younger students. "And you, Malfoy." Harry, glancing over, saw Malfoy stoop to snatch up something leering. He showed to the Crabbe and Goyle, and Harry realized that he got Riddle's diary. "Give that back," Harry said quietly. "Wonder who Potter's written in this," said Malfoy. Obviously had noticed the year and the cover, and Harry's own diary. A hush fell over the onlookers. Ginny was staring at the diary to Harry, looking terrified. "Hand it over, Malfoy," said Percy sternly. "When I've had a look," said Malfoy, waving the diary, taunting to Harry. Percy said, "As school prefect," but Harry had lost his temper, pulled out his wand, and shouted, "Expelliarmus!" As, as soon as Snape disarmed Lockhart, and Malfoy found the diary shooting out of his hand and into the air, Ron, grinning broadly, caught it. "Harry," said Percy loudly, "no magic in the corridors. I'll have to report this, you know." But Harry didn't care. He was one up on Malfoy, and that was worth 5 points for Gryffindor any day. Malfoy was looking furious, and Ginny passed him to enter the classroom and yelled spitefully at her, "I don't think Potter liked your valentine much." Ginny covered her face with her hands and ran into class, snarling. Ron pulled out his wand too, but Harry pulled him away. Ron didn't need to spend the whole Charms class belching slugs. It wasn't until they reached Professor Flitwick's class that Harry noticed something rather odd about Riddle's diary. All the other books were drenched in scarlet ink. The diary, however, was clear as it had been before the ink bottle had smashed all over it. He tried to point this out to Ron, but Ron was having trouble with his wand. Again, large purple bubbles were blossoming out of the end, and he wasn't much interested in anything else. Harry went to bed before anyone else in the dormitory that night. This was partly because he didn't think he could stand Fred and George singing, "His eyes are green and fresh pickled toad," one more time, and partly because he wanted to examine Riddle's diary again, and he knew that Ron thought he was wasting his time. Harry sat in the four-poster bed, flicked through the blank pages, not one of which had a trace of scarlet ink on it. Then he pulled the new bottle out of his bedside cabinet, dipped his quill in it, and dropped a blot onto the first page of the diary. The ink shone brightly on the paper for a second, and then, as though it was being sucked into the page, vanished. Excited, Harry held the quill up for a second time and wrote, "My name is Harry Potter." The words shone momentarily in the page, and they too sank without a trace. Then at last something happened. Oozing back from the page, his very own ink, came words Harry had never written. "Hello, Harry Potter. My name is Tom Riddle. How did you come to be by my diary?" These words, too, faded away, but not before Harry could start scribbling back. "Someone tried to flush it down the toilet." He waited for the Riddle's reply. "Luckily, I recorded the memories in some more lasting way than ink. But I always knew there would be those who would not won't waste out this diary read." "What do you mean?" Harry scrawled, blotting the pages of excitement. "I mean that this diary holds memory of terrible things. Things that were covered up. Things that happened at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry." "That's where I am now," Harry wrote quickly. "I'm at Hogwarts. And horrible stuff's happening here. Do you know anything about the Chambers of Secrets?" His heart was hammering, and Riddle's reply came quickly, written untidier, as though he was hurrying to tell what he knew. "Of course I know about the Chamber of Secrets. In my day, they told us it was a legend, and that it did not exist. But this was a lie. In my 5th year, the Chamber of Secrets was opened by a monster, attacked several students, finally killing one. I caught the person who opened the chamber, and he was expelled. But the headmaster, Professor Dippet, ashamed that such a thing happened at Hogwarts, forbade me to tell the truth. A story was given out that the girl had died from a freak accident. They gave me a nice, shiny, engraved trophy for my trouble, and warned me to keep my mouth shut. But I knew it could happen again. The monster lived on, and the one who has the power to release it was not imprisoned." Harry nearly upset his ink bottle in a hurry to write back. "It's happening now. That there have been 3 attacks, and no one seems to know who's behind them. Who was it last time?" "I can show you if you like," said Riddle's reply. "You don't have to take my word for it. I can take you inside my memory of the night when I caught him." Harry hesitated, his quill suspended over the diary. What did Riddle mean? How could he be taking somebody else's memory? He glanced nervously at the door of the dormitory, which was growing dark. As he held back the diary, he saw fresh words looming. "Let me show you." Harry, at the fraction of a second, wrote the 2 words "OK." The pages of the diary began to blow with what caught the high wind, stopping halfway through in the month of June. Mouth hanging open, Harry saw that there was a little square for June 13th, seemed to have turned into a minuscule television screen. His hands trembling slightly, he raised the book to his eye against the little window. Before he knew it, what was happening? He was tilting forward. The window was widening. He felt his whole body leave the bed, and then he was pitched head first through the opening of the page into a whirl of color and shadow. His feet hit the solid ground and stood shaking at the blurred shapes around him that came suddenly into focus. He knew immediately where he was. The circular room was the sleeping portrait with Dumbledore's office. But it wasn't Dumbledore who was sitting behind the desk. A wizened, frail-looking wizard, bald except for a few wisps of white hair, was reading a letter in the candlelight. Harry had never seen this man before. I'm sorry, he said shakily. I didn't mean to butt in. But the wizard didn't look up. He continued to read, frowning slightly. Harry drew near to the desk. I'll just go, shall I? And the wizard ignored him. He didn't even seem to have heard him. Thinking that the wizard might be deaf, Harry raised his voice. Sorry, I disturbed you. I'll go now, he half shouted. The wizard folded the letter and, with a sigh, stood up, walked past Harry without glancing at him, and went to draw the curtains in his windows. The sky outside was ruby red. It seemed to be sunset. The wizard went back to the desk and sat down. He twiddled his thumbs, watching the door. Harry looked around his office. No Fawkes the Phoenix, no whirling silver contraptions. This was Hogwarts, as Riddle had known it, meaning this unknown wizard or the headmaster, not Dumbledore, that he, Harry, that little more than a phantom, completely invisible to the people 50 years ago. There was a knock at the door. Enter, said the old wizard with a feeble voice. A boy about 16 entered and off his pointed hat. A silver badge was glinting on his chest. He was much taller than Harry, but he too had jet black hair. Ah, Riddle, said the headmaster. Do you want me to see me, Professor Dippet? Said Riddle. He looked nervous. Sit down, said Dippet. I've just been reading the letter you sent me. Oh, Riddle said, as he sat down, gripping his hands together very tightly. My dear boy, said Dippet kindly, I cannot possibly let you stay at school over the summer. Surely you want to go home for the holidays? No, said Riddle at once. I'd much rather stay at Hogwarts than go back to that you live in a Muggle orphanage. During the holidays, I believe, said Dippet curiously. Yes, sir, said Riddle, reddening slightly. You are Muggle-born? Half-blood, sir, said Riddle. Muggle father, witch mother. And they're both. And both your parents? My mother died just after I was born, sir. They told me at the orphanage she lived just long enough to name me. Tom, after my father. Marvalo, after my grandfather. Dippet clucked his tongue sympathetically. The thing is, Tom, he sighed, special arrangements might have been made for you, but in the current circumstances. You mean all these attacks, sir? Said Riddle, with Harry's heart leapt in to move closer, to scared of missing anything. Precisely, said the headmaster. My dear boy, you must see how foolish it would be to me to allow you to remain in the castle when term ends, particularly in light of the recent tragedy, the death of that poor little girl. You will be safer far from in your orphanage. As a matter of fact, the Ministry of Magic is even now talking about closing the school. We're no near locating the source of the unpleasantness. Riddle's eyes widened. Sir, if the person was caught, if all was stopped. What do you mean? Said Dippet, with a squeak in his voice, sitting up in his chair. Riddle, do you mean you know something about the attacks? No, sir, said Riddle quickly. But Harry was sure it was the same sort of no that he had been given Dumbledore. Dippet sank back and looked faintly disappointed. You may go, Tom. Riddle slid off the chair, slouched out of the room. Harry followed him. Down the moving staircase he went, emerging next to the gargoyle in the darkening corridor. Riddle stopped, and so did Harry. Watching him, Harry could tell that Riddle was doing some serious thinking. He was biting his lip, his forehead furrowed. Then, as though he had suddenly reached a decision, he hurried off, Harry gliding noiselessly behind him. They didn't see each other in person until they reached the entrance hall, and then the tall wizard with the long, sweeping, sunburned hair and a beard called to Riddle from the marble staircase. What are you doing wandering out this late, Tom? Harry gaped at the wizard. It was none other than the 50 years younger Dumbledore. I had to see the headmaster, sir, said Riddle. Well, hurry off to bed, said Dumbledore, giving Riddle exactly the kind of penetrating stare Harry knew oh so well. Best not be roam the corridors these days, not since. And he sighed heavily, bade Riddle good night, and strode off Riddle watched him walk out through the sight, and then, moving quickly, headed straight down to the stone steps to the dungeon with Harry in hot pursuit. But to Harry's disappointment, Riddle led him into the hidden passageway in the secret tunnel, but to very dungeon in which Harry had potions with Snape. The torches had been lit, and when Riddle pushed the door almost closed, Harry could only just see him, standing stock still by the door, watching the passage one side. It felt to Harry that there were at least an hour. All he could see was the figure of Riddle in the door, staring through the crack, waiting like a statue. And just when Harry had stopped feeling expectant to sense the start, wishing he could return to the present, he heard something move beyond the door. Someone was creeping along the passage. He heard whoever it was pass the dungeon where he and Riddle were hidden. Riddle, quiet as a shadow, edged through the door and followed. Harry tiptoed behind him, forgetting that he couldn't be heard. 4, perhaps 5 minutes followed the footsteps after Riddle stopped suddenly, his head inclined to the direction of the new noises. Harry heard a door creak open, and then something speaking in a hoarse whisper. "Come. Get you out of here. Come on now. In the box." There was something familiar about that voice. Riddle suddenly jumped around the corner. Harry stepped out behind him. He could see the dark outline of a huge boy who was crouching in front of the front door, a very large box next to it. "Evening, Rubeus," said Riddle sharply. The boy slammed the door shut and stood up. "What are you doing down here, Tom?" Riddle stepped closer. "It's all over," he said. "I'm going to have to turn you in, Rubeus. They're talking about closing Hogwarts if the attacks don't stop." "What do you—" "I don't think you mean to kill anyone, but monsters don't make good pets. I suppose you just let it out for exercise, and—" "I never killed no one," said the large boy, backing against the closed door from behind him. Harry could tell the funny rustling and licking. "Come on, Rubeus," said Riddle, moving yet closer. "The dead girl's parents will be here tomorrow. The least Hogwarts can do is to make sure the one thing that killed her daughter is slaughtered." "It wasn't him!" roared the boy, his voice echoing in the dark passage. "He wouldn't! He never!" "Stand aside," said Riddle, drawing out his wand. His spell lit the corridor with a sudden flash of light. The door behind the large boy flew open with such force that it knocked him into the wall opposite, and out of it came something that made Harry let out a long, piercing scream unheard by anyone. The vast, low-slung, hairy body and a tangle of black legs and a gleaming of many eyes and a pair of razor-sharp pincers. Riddle raised the wand again, but he was too late. The thing howled him over and scrambled to his feet, looked after it. It raised its wand, but the huge boy leapt on him and seized his wand and threw him back down, yelling, "No!" The scene whirled and the darkness became complete. Harry felt himself falling with a crash, and he landed spread-eagled on his four-poster bed in the Gryffindor dormitory, Riddle's diary lying open on his stomach. Before he had any time to regain his breath, the dormitory door opened and Ron came in. "There you are," he said. He sat up. He was sweating and shaking. "What's up?" said Ron, looking at him with concern. "It was Hagrid, Ron. Hagrid opened the Chamber of Secrets 50 years ago.